I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
We failed to come back to you guys, unfortunately, like we vowed we were going to last week. We said we were going to do one more podcast before the Mavericks kicked off action versus the LA Clippers in Game 1 of the Western Conference quarterfinals, the 4-5 matchup. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to do that just due to some scheduling interferences and whatnot. But obviously, with games back in action, we are back in action, and we are going to be covering each game of this series ad nauseum, as we have to do our due diligence in the playoffs. We may get a little bit frisky in terms of our analysis, get pretty in depth, but these may be some of the longer podcasts that we are going to have this season. But that's just kind of the nature of these playoffs and whatnot. We do want to get in deep and as deep into the basketball aspect of this as possible, because this is where an individual like Jaren and I, we earn our stripes. So nonetheless, we obviously know, or if you're listening to this podcast, I presume now that the Mavericks lost yesterday's Sunday matinee affair. We are recording this Monday night, so we weren't able to record last night, though we did plan to originally. So we're a little bit removed from the game. Tempers have flared a little bit. The Mavericks obviously lost 109-97, only put up 30 points in the first half. They came out very slow out the gate. It very much seemed as if Kawhi Leonard's right knee inflammation was lingering in their mind to an extent. Just from the perspective of how flat the Mavericks looked, perhaps they thought the Clippers would be a little bit more of an easy pushover. Obviously, there's no way of telling that for sure, but the way that they looked out there, especially some of the body language in the first half, that did seem like it was the case. Now, that's just kind of looking at it from large. We'll get, a lot more in depth into this game. The Mavericks did show some resilience in the second half. Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, both 30-plus point scorers in this game. In that second half, they both had stretches where they, were really working well off of one another. But the Mavericks offense at large throughout this game, outside of them, really seemed like, from a shot creation and playmaking aspect, pretty devoid, because there were not a lot of other contributors. PJ Washington, the only other guy in double digits with 11. Jaren, do we have anything else before we kick off, with this intro here? Or, I feel like I kind of wrapped it up pretty well there from a broad perspective. But if you would like to add anything, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, the Clippers came out and really punched the Mavericks in the face in that first half. Obviously, it was 56-30, only 8 points in the second quarter for the Mavericks. And I don't think Kyrie or Luka scored in that second quarter. Yeah, I mean, just quite a deflating loss for the Mavericks. Obviously, they need to pick up the energy, and they did so after halftime. But look, I mean, going into game 2, you obviously have to start the game out better than they did in game 1. That goes without saying. And a number of guys need to step up in a bigger way than they did in game 1. I think that that's pretty simple. But yeah, I mean, as far as anything that I wanted to say, that probably you covered it for the most part, and what I just wrapped it up with. So I think that we're good.
Yes. A great series of points here. Hopefully the Mavericks can gain some momentum in this series with the Clippers, obviously, because currently after game 1 in Los Angeles, it's especially with some of the game 1s that we've had in the past with the Mavericks, in the last few years, they've came out pretty electric in most instances. So this was a pretty stark contrast to that. We'll talk about all the reasons for that, as well as what the Clippers were doing to really deter the Mavericks, defense and whatnot. But more at large their offense, because the Mavericks, who have made their mark on the offensive end, all season, to an extent. Obviously having found this new, defensive identity within the last 20 games or so, but they have been labeled an offense sort of first team. So to see this, depreciation, in a game like this was pretty concerning. We'll get into all those reasons, of course, after the break. All right, Jaren. So getting back into it, obviously the Mavericks came flat out the gate like we talked about. What do you think specifically attributed to the Mavericks' slow start? Do you think it was, the narrative, that the Clippers maybe were a little bit weak and brittle without Kawhi Leonard playing? Do you think that the Mavericks' inexperience in the playoffs just sort of shell-shocked some of the players, perhaps like Gafford and, who hasn't really played in any, premier playoff series? I think he played in one playoff series, with the Wizards, but I think it was like a 1-8 or a 2-7 matchup. And then, also PJ Washington, he played a relatively decent game last afternoon. So not, shading him in any aspect, but obviously he, has never played in a playoff series. What do you think, was the main reason for Dallas' slow start?
I think, it was Luka and Kyrie's absence those past two games. I really think that played a role in the Mavericks kind of, losing traction on the offensive end. I think that was a huge part of why they only scored 30 points in that first half, was just how slow and how, I guess, rugged everything was throughout that first half. And I think it all, sort of stimulates from those final two games of the season that Luka and Kyrie missed collectively. I think another thing is a lot of these guys that are, I guess offensive, or not even offensive centric, but a lot of these role players for the Mavericks rely a lot on what Luka and Kyrie do. If you listen to our latest podcast, or not latest, but our latest game podcast, where we went over the Detroit and went over the Thunder games collectively. I think another thing that we kind of talked about was, how these role players just can't really play on their own without Luka and Kyrie creating for them, or at least the offense is not as, fluid without Luka and Kyrie. And I think that was kind of what we saw, was everybody kind of collectively getting back together, getting back in that sort of, I guess, rhythm that they got to at the end of the season. Obviously, in the second half, that picked up the offense. I think they outscored the Clippers by almost like 10 points. They outscored them by 14 points, I believe, in the second half. But yeah, I mean, I really think that a lot of it has to do with that 10-day delay that the Mavericks really suffered. Not even suffered, but really dealt with. Obviously, people had their gripes with it at the time, and now I think, that game one's over and wrapped up. People are probably having even more gripes with the Mavericks sitting two of their starters down. But at the end of the day, it was to prevent injuries. And if anybody's going to go nitpick anything, like, I don't think that they should nitpick that, 3 extra days that Luka and Kyrie sat. However, it really isn't an excuse at the end of the day to score 30 points and a half in, game one of a playoff series. Obviously, your energy should be very high. And as you said at the intro, like, the Mavericks historically have come out in game ones, very high energy with very high pace. Defenses always look good. And
In
that's
recent years, at least.
amazing at the Clippers. Obviously 30 points speaks for itself. 8 points in the second quarter is even worse. But yeah, I think that was really what it was, is the Mavericks got punched in the face early. Obviously, the Clippers came prepared without Kawhi Leonard, and props to them. Ivica Zubats, obviously James Harden started going off in the first quarter, but props to them. I mean, they were dealt a bad hand, and they looked like professionals in the outcome. And I think that that's what you're going to get out of a playoff team that's currently the 4 seed. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. Like I said, I think, a lot of contribution to that sort of extra 3 days that the Luka and Kyrie got, but at the end of the day, the Mavericks still needed to become prepared.
Yeah, no, you could definitely tell. I think just with both Luka and Kyrie's cadence, they were off a little bit on the offensive end. Specifically with Luka, he just didn't look as aggressive as he normally does. He obviously has shot the step back three at an all-time high level this year. But with Kyrie, also coming out of the gate, he was getting to his spots as he always does. But everything just kind of looked a little bit off. He kind of looked a little rushed in terms of, going up for some of those mid-range attempts. And, as eager as they were to get off to a hot start against the Clippers, over reliance on three-point shooting, role players not really being able to be a threat offensively. The Clippers stayed home really well on Dallas's wings, that being, PJ Washington, Derrick Jones Jr., even Dante Exum. they made sure that those guys did not really have a factor from an offensive standpoint. And, if those guys wanted to have a real factor in the game offensively, they needed to hit their shots and, at least, forge some sort of respect from outside, to build that sort of pedigree from, the Clippers, defenders to, maybe, guard them a little bit closer, allowing them some easier driving lanes and whatnot to attack off of, some more wild closeouts and whatnot. That obviously did not happen. It seems as if the Clippers, have done their scouting reports, their homework to an extent. They are going to try and make Dallas's role players beat them. At least that was a common theme of game one. And, more often than not, Dallas's role players, while their decision making wasn't necessarily bad, the Mavericks only had 8 turnovers on the game. They, they just seemed like they were, too often non-factors in this game. And, when they weren't connecting on their, 3-point shots, it didn't seem like there was enough off-ball movement being instilled. I don't know if that was from a coaching standpoint or, if that's guys not having the system down. I would, presume the former, obviously. But, with the Mavericks coaching, they, didn't really mix it up in terms of, trying to, really run some actions to get PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr., cutting backside or, at an angle. It did seem like, the Mavericks offense, as it has been, they were trying to, funnel that high pick and roll at the top of the key. And, if Luka could find the corner shooter, he was going to make that pass. But the Clippers did a really good job, like I said, of closing those passing lanes, staying home on the Mavericks wings. And Zubac played really stout interior defense. He's been one of the best, interior defenders in the league this year, especially in drop coverage. He's definitely, underrated in terms of his mobility as a center, I think, honestly, because of, some of these Mavericks Clippers playoff series where Luka has taken advantage of him, in one-on-one scenarios. But for a bigger guy, 7 foot, probably like 260, 265, he moves his feet a lot. I mean, he's, I wouldn't say he's at like in a Gobert, Miles Turner, that elite level. He moves his level a lot better than, say, like a Jonas Valanciunas, for a guy that size. And he's got a little bit of, decent athleticism. He's got some great size. And, when he solidifies the backbone of that Clippers defense, they allow their wings to play out in space, kind of, help on the Clippers wings do a great job of, helping at the exact right time. I thought in that game the other day, they were just really, really diligent. Jaren, you kind of talked about this with me before the podcast, but they were really diligent about, just collapsing right at the point of attack. It seemed as if, right as Luka or Kyrie, would make that gather step or that move to, try and either drive or, set up some sort of mid-range attempt for themselves. Terrence Mann, Amir Coffey, was scrambling right there, from a help standpoint. And, the Clippers rotate, they were rotating well enough over at the back end to be able to get back to a Dallas shooter before, there could be really any passing lane that Luka or Kyrie could exploit. So some great defense from their perspective, but the Mavericks overall have just got to be a lot more aggressive off the catch. They've got to do a better job of putting pressure on the rim. I mean, point blank, regardless of who's going to be defending them this series. Their inability, the Mavericks to diversify their offense, their inability to get to the rim was really something that plagued them in this game versus Clippers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a big, talking point, like you said, diversification of the offense. In that first half and, really up until the middle of the third quarter, whenever Kyrie started to cook, there was just very elementary school offensive sets. It was high screen pick and roll, high screen pick and roll, high screen pick and roll. Very little, I guess very little of the offense that we've come to know and love over this, last 20 game stretch of the regular season. Obviously, the Clippers are easily going to pick up on that. They're a level above in terms of defense. You have Paul George, Ivica Zubac, as you mentioned. I guess how much he's taken a step in terms of his defense. Amir Coffey, Terrence Mann, all these top tier defenders, all these guys that play really well within their role. Outside of Paul George, he's obviously a star, but a lot of these guys can pick up on those easy sort of elementary school, I guess offensive sets, and that's exactly what happened. Terrence Mann was a guy I felt like in that first half that really, really messed things up for the Mavericks. I think in that sort of high screen pick and roll situation, he did a really good job of blitzing whoever had the ball, whether it was Kyrie or Luca. He did a fantastic job of blitzing the ball and making it hard for Luca or Kyrie to make that easy entry pass or easy lob pass. And then obviously, as you mentioned, Zubats is a really big or really good drop coverage big, and he was able to easily pick up Daniel Gafford or Derek Lively, whoever that was. He was able to tag him with ease, pretty much, from the 3-point line all the way down to the hoop. There was no point, other than one, I think, opening up in the third quarter. There was one basket
Oh
where
yeah, we're
Daniel Gafford
lively.
assisted.
The Clippers blitzed a little bit too early.
Yeah,
And
and
was
was
able
it Lively
to
or
get
Gafford?
an
I can't
overhead
remember.
pass. It was to Lively, I believe.
Lively.
I know Lively got one dunk in the game. I remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, but outside of that possession, I really feel like the Mavericks were struggling to get their bigs involved. Obviously, going into game two, that has to
And
be a point of
I hate to
emphasis.
interrupt you real quick, but just to be like clear, that's been the hallmark of this Mavericks team the last
Yes, yeah,
20 games of
absolutely.
the
Yeah.
season. Yeah.
Yeah, that the bulk of their offense, not saying like a percentage of their sets, like probably, 60, above 50% of their sets have come in from, the high screen pick and roll, which a lot of NBA offenses work that way, but I think more so Mavericks more than anybody because they rely so heavily on the sort of space that's created, and then obviously they need corner shooters like PJ and Derek Jones Jr. to hit their shots, which is, to your point about these defenders staying home, they did a really good job of that about not, allowing these sort of kick out lanes or anything like that. But, going back to game two, a point of emphasis has to be to get Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively involved. I'm not so worried about Derek Lively. That was his first game back, I think over 3 weeks, over 4 weeks of injury. He's kind of getting worked into it. I would not be surprised if he, plays similar minutes like this in game two, as long as he's not played off the court, which he kind of was in game one. But Gafford has got to play better. That was probably the worst Gafford game since we traded for him, I would say, or probably one of them. I think the Indiana Pacers games were probably up there, but outside of that, this is probably the worst one. Obviously, it's in the biggest moment of his career, and he simply just didn't show up. But he took accountability. It sounded like in those post game comments, he pretty much came out and said, I've got to be better. I didn't come prepared and whatnot, and didn't have any excuses. But yeah, a point of emphasis from the Mavericks and Jason Kidd has to be to get that high screen pick and roll and get Gafford involved. Because as long as you can get those bigs involved, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here. As long as you can get those bigs involved, you're at least taking away some of Zubac's, I guess pressure in terms of what he can do on the rim.
Yeah, and obviously, we've talked about just, from a general like strength perspective, how much Gafford has meant to this Mavericks lineup, having his physicality out there on a nightly basis. But obviously, when you're in the playoffs, you're against the best in the West. And, the Mavericks aren't playing against a center like Zubac, every night. But, if you want to make the cliche counter argument, almost every other center that they're playing against in the playoffs is probably better than Zubac from an offensive perspective, that they'll face from here on out. Maybe, you know, even if if you're just looking across like the whole Western Conference like playoffs, everybody who's 1 through 8. I mean, everybody's got some pretty good dynamic bigs. You can even maybe say the Mavericks, they definitely have some of the best defensive bigs, but as far from offense perspective, they probably have like the least dynamic bigs in the Western Conference playoffs. So the Mavericks have to, get pressure on the rim in the pick and roll, and it starts with, Lively and Gafford setting hard screens at the point of attack, and then using their speed, using their pacing to really kind of throw Zubac off in those pick and rolls. I would be interested, especially with as good as Luca is, at snaking the pick and roll to see if the Mavericks do kind of, any sort of pick and rolls where Gafford rescreens, tries to get a body on, Zubac in the paint just to throw him off a little. But they need to do some different things with their, cadence and their pacing in those pick and rolls, because that's going to help them win the advantage, because obviously, Lively and Gafford, they both probably have, at least in Lively's case, he has length over Zubac. I don't know about Gafford, but they both have athleticism over him, obviously, and that's their only drawing point where the Mavericks can really win at the center position, because Gafford, assuredly he understands that he wasn't physical enough on the defensive end, but what, Zubac is a big body. Like Gafford's like 6'10", 240. Like we talked about, Zubac is like 7'1", like 265. And he proved that on the other end of the court. And he schooled Gafford time and time again, just, traditional post game, back to the basket big, something that we don't really see too as much in the NBA. But it's not like there's none of these bigs in these league in this league. Obviously, there's obviously Nikola Jokic, who me and Jaren are watching right now as the Nuggets are playing the Lakers in a very tightly contested game. There's been some great playoff basketball on this Monday evening. Just in terms of, especially with that Knicks
That Knicks game was
Sixers
wild.
game was wild, that ending, if you guys caught that, but we won't go too much into detail on that. But obviously, to my point, like, Jokic, like there are still back to the basket, centers, Valanciunas, and it's the Mavericks have to be able to, match that intensity. We've seen at times during the regular season where they had problems against this, particularly before the trade deadline with Gafford, but Gafford's done a good job against Bam. He's done a good job against some really physical centers. I think he has the strength to be able to match Zubac and at least deter him on, more than 50% of his attempts, hold him to a respectable field goal percentage. But we're obviously going to have to see, the proof in the pudding in game 2 and going forward in this series on both ends. The Mavericks bigs have got to be a lot better, not just Gafford. He obviously had the slow start and whatnot. And, we can obviously make a lot of excuses for Lively, and a lot of them are valid given his situation, obviously. But that doesn't negate the fact that he's going to need to bring a lot more physicality from a defensive perspective. Both him and Gafford, obviously, and especially from a rebounding perspective, because the Mavericks were they kind of looked like sitting ducks out there sometimes, just letting Zubac, even some of the Clippers wings like Amir Coffey, Terrence Mann, just grab some of these rebounds easily. They've got to box out. They've got to bring a better presence from that perspective, and not be over reliant on being able to get tip outs and the ball bouncing their way just for them to get a rebound, because at times, like yesterday, it seemed like the effort wasn't 100% there, especially in that first half from a defensive and rebounding perspective. And as good as the Mavericks effort has been over the last 20 games of the season, with these, I know that they have some days off in between games, but I mean, everybody did in the playoffs, heading into these playoffs, obviously. And, all the reports were that the Mavericks had a good few days of practice, got Lively back into the action. But things, obviously just didn't, flow through in that first half. And the bigs lack or inability, rather, to play big was probably the biggest reason for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you look at the final box score in terms of rebounding, the Mavericks only got out rebounded by 4. And additionally, the Clippers only had one more offensive rebound than the Mavericks at the end of the game. Obviously, I think that these numbers are skewed by I think that these numbers would be way lopsided, from first half to second half. I feel like, adding to your point, Will, like I think that the Clippers made it a point of emphasis to attack the ball as soon as it was up in the air. Obviously, like you said, Amir Coffey, Terrence Mann, all these different level of guards, they were Russell Westbrook. I mean, he had multiple
Yeah.
rebounds. They made it a point of emphasis to attack the Mavericks. Not saying that the Mavericks are traditionally, or they are traditionally, a bad rebounding team, but since they've been on their winning streak, they haven't been known to be a bad rebounding team. So I think the Clippers went and they're trying to not necessarily expose that, but make it a point of emphasis that, like, look, we're not going to let you get any rebound that you want. And, props to the Clippers. They obviously came out with a game plan, defensively, and in terms of those 50-50 balls and possessions, how much effort they came out with. They came out with a game plan, and obviously, as I've said before, they punched the Mavericks in the mouth. Mavericks did respond in the second half, obviously. They did outscore them. But look, I think if we're going to start nitpicking just a little bit more things before we move on to the second half, PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr., outside of really Josh Green, the only like role player that had a solid game, and he was only checked in for
I think
7
PJ
minutes.
Washington had a pretty solid
Hey,
game.
he's got to be better though. In that first half, it was rough, and that's why I'm saying, like, he got his points in garbage time. In my opinion, I think he did.
No, I mean,
Uh,
he had that 3 in the first quarter, and then he had that
Outside of that,
good
he didn't. I
attack
don't think he
close.
had a single point in the first half. So I think
He
he
had
just
like
had those.
he had 5 points. I mean, they only scored 30 in the first half, so I mean,
Yeah,
he
okay,
had
I
6
guess,
of
yeah.
those points.
5 of, yeah, okay. I guess
Yeah.
if you're putting it that way. No, but still, I mean, these guys have got to be better. We need still putting point of emphasis. PJ Washington, I think, has got to get more involved in the offense. I don't know if Jason Kidd kind of neglected that. Obviously, we need Luka and Kyrie all, what is it, like they combined for 64 points or something like that. Yeah, 64 points. Obviously, we need all four of those 64 points to make the scoreboard look as, I'm air quoting here, if you're listening, but to make the scoreboard look as good as it did. But as I said, either way, Derek Jones Jr., Daniel Gafford, Tim Hardaway Jr., all these guys need to step up off the bench or step up in their roles and make shots. And that's obviously going to be the difference in the series is if the Mavericks can't make shots, it's going to make it a lot tougher for them to win this series. Obviously this team hasn't been great shooting wise, outside of Luka and Kyrie, but they still, the job has got to get done. So I don't know if the Mavericks need to necessarily rely on different guys or whatnot, but yeah, shooting has got to be a point of emphasis in game two. Obviously, your shot's going to come and go, but Tim Hardaway Jr., I mean, that was just atrocious. I'm not even sure. I don't even think he really took that many shots. Yeah, he only took like 2 for 5, but still, he's got to get better looks than what he did. He's got to get more, Tim Hardaway open looks. But yeah, I mean, like, the first half was definitely rough. Going into the second half, the Mavericks obviously came out with a lot more energy. You could see it right out of the bounce, right out of the halftime. The Mavericks came out with a lot more intensity. They came out with a lot more energy. And they started to make little runs here and there, obviously throughout the third quarter, Paul George, and a little bit more of, James Harden and whatnot, kind of, I guess, deterred these Maverick runs. I think that at one point the Mavericks got within 17 in the third quarter, and then obviously that was ballooned back up to like a 26-point lead, based off of some Paul George and James Harden and obviously Terrence Mann threes. But yeah, I mean the Mavericks, they made an effort to at least make a game of it, but these, like I said, this offense has just got to be more fluid. Obviously, 30 points doesn't help you, but this offense really does have to be more fluid moving forward.
No, 100%. You know, the Mavericks offense, obviously, in the first half, definitely suffered, from, uh, in part because, Luka and Kyrie were certainly settling for some looks, versus really trying to, attack the pressure that was the Clippers defense. But, like we talked about with the Clippers defense, they had a lot to do with that themselves. In the second half, maybe be argued that the Clippers left their foot off the gas a little bit, from a defensive perspective. But regardless, the Mavericks did a lot better job of applying pressure on the rim. They did a lot better job of getting out in transition a few times. I think the Clippers had I want to say like 12 turnovers on the night. Mavericks did a pretty, in
Well,
the second half. That's not a large number by any, stretch of the imagination. But in the second half, the Mavericks were able to force a few turnovers, get out in transition, which kind of helped that. Josh Green got out in transition a few times and pushed the ball, or Luka pushed the ball out to him rather. I know Kyrie got out in transition off an outlet pass from Luka, off a jump ball, I believe. So there were some, really positive signs in terms of, different ways the Mavericks can mix things up stylistically, to, give them an advantage against a team that has a really good defense in the half court. But obviously, it's going to be tough, when you're going against, a team that's, as defensively versatile as the Clippers. And I mean, obviously they didn't even have Kawhi Leonard. I think honestly, Jaren, that's a good point to start at. What did you think of how, the Clippers, played from an offensive perspective with, we already kind of talked about Zubac, but, we haven't talked at all about James Harden. Historically, James Harden's obviously been a great game one performer, and sometimes it kind of, treks down a little bit as the series goes along. But obviously, he came out pretty electric as he traditionally does. And Paul George, while he didn't, have like a 30 plus point, crazy sort of game, he did just enough, and the Clippers were able to have enough offensive, star power and shot making to be able to get over the Mavericks, So I just wanted to get your thoughts, on how the Clippers, offense was, really able to throw the Mavericks off, even though the Mavericks held up, fairly okay defensively.
yeah, obviously the Clippers came out of the game with an offensive mindset. James Harden opened up the game with 4 straight threes. That obviously, I think gained some confidence for a lot of Clippers players. And obviously Ivica Zubac had his way with Daniel Gafford throughout most of that first quarter. And I really think that that's kind of what the, offense really stemmed from, at least in that first half, was James Harden, Ivica Zubac, and then obviously Paul George. I think more so in that second half was whenever we saw, more of their role players take advantage of it and more advantage. Additionally, Paul George. Paul George didn't really do much in the first half, and then he took over around that third and fourth quarter mark. But Terrence Mann hit a couple of big time threes to really not necessarily keep the Clippers in it by any means, but to keep the Mavericks out of the game, I would say, is probably the best way to put it. A couple of timely corner threes. Obviously, Amir Coffey hit a couple of threes as well. He kind of was having a rough game until that point. I think that defensively and offensively, he really turned it on in that second half, which is kind of funny because pretty much every Clipper was kind of the opposite. They had such an amazing first half, and then obviously, there's probably a number of factors. One of which was the Clippers probably did take their foot off the gas a little bit, but Amir Coffey turned it on really in that second half, and obviously he only finished with 6 points, but two timely 3-point shots to really keep the Mavericks out of it. Going to their bench, obviously Russell Westbrook, he was active all night. And, really outside of that, Ty Lue kept it an 8-man lineup, which, it was a playoff lineup. Obviously, whenever Kawhi gets in, that'll probably change more to a 9-man. We'll obviously see if Amir Coffey or anybody like that maybe gets bumped down to a minimalistic role. But Russell Westbrook off the bench really kept the Clippers kept the foot on the gas. I would say is probably the best term. I already mentioned it, but a couple of big time rebounds, a couple of big time offensive rebounds too. And
Double
obviously
big time
13
threes.
what? Yeah, a couple of threes as well. One of, pretty much every three that he took, all four of them, I think the Mavericks were kind of daring him to take it. Obviously, the Clippers, he's really worked on that shot over this year. He's actually not as like terrible as fans think that he usually is. Like usually people watch him take that and they're like, oh, okay, go right ahead. But he's actually worked on that quite a bit. I think he's probably like 37 or 36%, but that's way more than like 32 or 33, whatever he was on the Clipper or whatever he was on the Lakers a few years back. Um, but yeah, he hit a big time 13-point performance off the bench. Brought a lot of energy. Obviously got, tangled up with PJ Washington early in the game. That was kind of an instance, they pointed out in the broadcast, but that was kind of an instance where Russell Westbrook was just trying to look for a reason to get turned up. And, no fault to PJ Washington. He didn't really do much. I don't even think he kind of just got tangled up, and Russell Westbrook was the one who started the sort of interaction between the two, I guess you could say. But Westbrook did a great job. He did his job, which is, really turning up this Clippers team. If they're even, flat or coming out flat or anything like that, you always, you have a guy off the bench that is going to produce and have, big time energy in any big game. And that was obviously in Sunday's game. He came in and, really did produce a lot. I think that the biggest, outside of Zubats, obviously Zubats, I think was probably the biggest surprise as far as Clippers go. But James Harden, James Harden had an amazing game, kind of turned back the meter. I wouldn't say quite primes James Harden, but I would say, Brooklyn Nets, maybe first year Sixers type James Harden. In that first half, it was definitely prime James Harden. It was 2016 type feel. But no, he
He
really
was
did
moving fast, which was
yeah,
was
he's moving
really surprising
fast.
me. Yeah.
And he was hitting step back threes from the logo pretty much. He had that one, I forget who was on. It was kind of a mismatch. I think it may have been Maxi Kleba. And yeah, he hit that from pretty much the logo after a switch. And yeah, he obviously finished with 28 points and started out the game 4 of 4 from three, as I said at the top of the segment. But yeah, I mean, really a big game from him. 39 big minutes. There is I do want to push back on this. There is a narrative going around on Mavs Twitter, if any of y'all are listening to this, where game one James Harden is massive, and then game two James Harden it just sort of disappears. This is a completely different version of James Harden, and I know a lot of people are going to bank on, oh, it's just James Harden. He's probably going to stink it up at one point. But I mean, if yesterday tells you anything, it's the fact that he's obviously here to stay. He was having a rough go of it closing out the season. I'm not even sure he scored over 20 points more than like 3 times in the last 30 games of the season. Obviously he's turned that around, 28 points in the first game of a playoff game. Maybe that is just, adrenaline running high. It's the first game, intensity's high. He's probably been looking forward to this game, for over a week now. But look, I mean, 28 points kind of speaks for itself, and 39 minutes, obviously great shooting from him. And yeah, I mean, outside of that, the Clippers didn't really have much to worry about. They did their job as far as buying time for Kawhi Leonard. I would be surprised if we see him in game two. I know this is kind of getting ahead, but I would be surprised if we see him in game two just because of the fact that they won game one so handily. I'm not saying that they're going to rely on, exactly the same game plan that they came out with, because obviously the Mavericks played a lot better in that second half. But to the Clippers' credit, they came out there, they did their job without their superstar. And they really did look like the better team throughout that whole entire game.
Yeah, most certainly. And I think there's a lot of eeriness up in the air in terms of, if Kawhi is going to be available or not for that game too. He's obviously listed as questionable right now. And, with that right knee inflammation, it seems as if it's something that they're just operating with on a day-to-day basis because he's obviously had, it seems as if, that knee's been operated on before and whatnot. He, has had pain in that knee for a couple of weeks, despite there being no like structural tear or anything that actually happened. So, obviously Tyronn Lue had a vote of confidence that he'll be ready to go at some point in this series. I could very well see him playing tomorrow. I know that there was a report earlier here today that they were doing some walkthroughs and whatnot in practice. He obviously didn't partake in contact today because the Clippers weren't doing any contact practice. So it'll be interesting to see if he plays and whatnot. That would change the dynamics of the series a lot. And if the Clippers are playing anywhere near as well as they were playing in game one, in game two, getting Kawhi Leonard added on to that is going to be a lot to overcome if you are the Dallas Mavericks. And, we'll just have to see what happens in terms of that. But obviously, Kawhi's impending health is something that could definitely come in and affect this series in a huge facet. That's why it is such a letdown that the Mavericks lost a game like this because even though it was game one and on the road and whatnot, and it is a little bit easy to toss away from that perspective. Certainly not easy to toss away from the perspective that you get an opportunity to win a game without Kawhi Leonard being healthy. This was a clear opportunity for the Mavericks to take advantage, and they were unable to do so. Going forward, Jaren, what are some of the adjustments that you think that the Mavericks should make heading into game two? As well as anything else you'd like to bounce off of, from game one that we didn't really cover. Any player performances that you'd like to highlight. If you want to go in depth to any more guys, feel free.
Yeah, so I guess I want to highlight two defensive matchups that I liked what the Mavericks brought in the second half. I know in our, not to call us head coaches of NBA or anything like that, but we did call out the matchup that, PJ Washington would likely be guarding Paul George, and then Derrick Jones Jr. would be guarding James Harden. The Mavericks actually didn't really open out the game like that, which I was very surprised to see. I think it was the opposite. I think they flipped it. PJ was guarding James, and then obviously DJJ was guarding Paul George. I think that was kind of an emphasis on who they thought was gonna, obviously have the ball more in their hands, which they thought Paul George. But obviously they switched that in the second half, which I think should have been the initial matchup in the first place. But I did like what I saw there. Obviously in that second half, Paul George got cooking and whatnot. That's just Paul George being Paul George. He's gonna hit those really tough shots, and that's exactly what we did, or what he did. I think PJ really made it as tough as he could for him, and
I
then
thought he played elite defense on him last night.
yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as
Or
elite as you can get, it was just
afternoon.
better offense.
Yeah.
But to that point, I think that was probably the matchup that the Mavericks liked what they saw after that first half. They went with it in the second half, and obviously it was the right move. James Harden didn't really get much outside of that. I think he had 22 or 24 first half points, I want to say. I might be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure it's somewhere in the 20s. Obviously, probably wasn't even playing as hard as he was in that first half. That's probably another reason why he only finished with 28. But outside of that, I really like the switching that we saw in that from that first to second half. One guy, who I actually do really want to talk about is Josh Green. He only got limited minutes in this one, 9 minutes, and I really think he only saw the floor in that second half for sure, throughout large parts of that fourth quarter. He only finished with 4 points, but he had a really big 4 points, even though it all came at the line. I think defensively he really switched the tide of that game. Now I'm not saying the Clippers were obviously playing in garbage time. They had a couple of questionable turnovers to say, and that's what Josh Green really picked on as far as the steals go. But I think Josh really did shift a little bit as far as the defensive intensity goes. I think he was the most intense defender the Mavericks had all game long, which is a lot to say for a guy who only played 9 minutes. But he came in there, he did his job. Obviously, well, I think it was 3 games back since his ankle injury that he suffered against the Thunder. I think that was his fourth game back from that. And yeah, I mean, I think that this was by far his best game. Obviously, I want to see more minutes from him in the second half, in the game rather. Sorry, but I liked what I saw from him. I don't think that there's anything offensively you can nitpick yet. I don't even think he attempted a field goal outside of his two free throw or outside of his two attempts at the line. But Josh Green, I want to see more from him in game two, like I said. And I feel like he really did bring a lot of juice. I'm not saying he's going to start or anything like that, but I could very well see if DJJ, struggles as much as he did from the offensive perspective, and Josh Green just has a absolute, good game from the offensive end in game two. I could very well see Josh taking over that starting role, especially because it's a playoff series, and you have to make those sort of, you know, game time decision adjustments from game to game. But I say as far as highlighting one player, that's probably who I feel like, as far as off the bench goes, probably had the best game. Didn't really see much out of Dante Exum. I mean, he had a pretty rough game. I
Well, I
like I
I
said,
gonna bring up a point about Green. I think before a kid would consider, replacing him in the starting lineup with Derrick Jones Jr., he'd probably, see if Josh is, if he, insert him into Dante Exum's role as of right
yeah,
now. If Exum continues to, kind of be a non-factor, if you will, offensively, we're obviously going to see, how much that changes in game two. But the Mavericks role players, across the board, Tim Hardaway Jr., Dante Exum, I think going forward, Josh Green definitely has an opportunity to steal some minutes from them if he continues, that level of defensive intensity and, selfishness, in terms of his offensive play and, especially his ability to get out in transition. So we'll see how that goes going forward.
yeah, absolutely. Like I said, to your point, I think that he probably takes more of the Exum role. Exum obviously finished with like more than half the minutes that Josh Green finished with. So, to your point, I think that we could very well see Josh more so in that role by game three or game four, assuming he plays as good as he did in that first game. Well, I mean, like, I think Maxey had a pretty solid game.
Yeah, I wanted to. I don't know if he, I think he played pretty decent defensively. He was obviously tasked, with being a small ball five at some points. That's kind of what I wanted to bring up, before we kind of got to, or more towards the game two adjustments and whatnot. That was a little bit of a wrinkle that Jason Kidd threw in when the Mavericks were down, I think over 20, just trying to catalyze some sort of run, change something up stylistically. They went away, from Lively and, Gafford veered away from, running the rim rolling bigs, and, they valued the spacing, at points during that third quarter, and they ran Maxey at the five. It did open up some spacing for the Mavericks, to get to the rim, get some, better attempts from Luka and Kyrie and whatnot. You saw the Clippers defenders obviously, having to play a little bit more attentive, with that paint not being clogged up, with, defender not being backed out there with Maxey, spreading the 3-point line. But, when the Mavericks do run 5-out lineups like that, Maxey's not necessarily like, he can shoot, of course, but, his 3-point shot hasn't been, the pillar of consistency that you'd hope for to close the regular season. He's obviously trending in the right direction. His defense has been really good. He's, especially from a switching perspective, guarding both bigs and, guards, he's done a phenomenal job. And I think, being, not having to be overextended in a, larger role as he has been in the past, has definitely helped with that. But, if he's not hitting the three, then that kind of, limits the Mavericks offensive dynamism out there because, beyond Luke and, Kyrie, they still really don't have a lot of creators on the floor at that point. Typically in those lineups, unless, you're running, like Exum or Green out there with them. So what did you think of those small ball lineups that the Mavericks ran?
Yeah, obviously, it's kind of funny because I think it worked, as far as game progression goes, that was definitely the right move. That was definitely the right decision to make. But that's something that I don't want to see, a heavy reliance on moving forward.
We also have to
Um,
take into consideration that, it was later sort of in that third quarter when the Clippers were kind of letting their foot off the gas a little bit. Obviously they were still playing hard. It's a playoff game, but they had, rotated some of their starters out. They were seeing what the bench had a little bit, but they were still playing their full rotation.
yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm not saying, it came in like garbage time minutes or anything like that. I'm just saying the reliance on the small ball five. We saw, whenever the Mavericks did go through their last little rough stretch, or rough spell in the regular season, there was a lot of reliance on that small ball five during that stretch, to kind of keep the Mavericks, offensively intact with those, better teams at that time. Obviously that didn't work out too well for them. And I'm not saying that this, lineup isn't necessarily going to work out for the Mavericks in the long run. But obviously, I think it was the adjustment to make at that time. I'm, no knock on Kid, for that adjustment. Obviously, you kind of want to see more. I know you just wrote a piece about how Zubats kind of dominated the Mavericks bigs. I'm not saying I want to see a too big lineup by any means, but if we did see a lineup of Gafford and maybe Maxi, um, I wouldn't be necessarily opposed to that, just to get some physicality, just to get some more bodies down low. But as far as the small ball five goes, unless if you're in an offensive rut or anything like that, obviously Maxi's not gonna, be the biggest offensive producer. I mean, he only had 3 points, and I think those came off the free throw line. Um, he's never gonna be that sort of offensive producer. At least, in 4 of the 7 games, he's never gonna be. But I did like what I see, or I did like what I saw out of those minutes. But yeah, like I said, I just don't want to see a heavy reliance on those minutes moving forward.
No, yeah, definitely. Because, if the Mavericks are going to, really inflict their will and, beat the Clippers in this series, they're going to have to at least, have an equal level of play, from their, two rim rolling, rim protecting centers, with Zubac. So we'll have to see how that goes going forward. Obviously, Jaren, did you want to get into some game two adjustments and, maybe talk even a little bit about what it would like if what it would look like for the Mavericks matchup wise if Kawhi plays versus if he doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as far as adjustment goes, I covered pretty much everything that I feel like I wanted to cover. I think, the, I guess, sort of 8-man lineup is probably as good as it's going to get. Maybe Tim Hardaway loses a few minutes. Maybe Josh Green gets a few of those minutes. This is obviously just sort of speculation, but if Kawhi is healthy, that's obviously going to change a lot of things, for both teams. The Clippers aren't going to have Amir Coffey in their starting lineup for obvious reasons. And having a sort of three-headed monster like the Clippers do, that's only going to make things more difficult, I would say, for the Mavericks. Obviously, like, you're probably going to have Luka guarding one of those three guys, whoever that is, just to keep up with size. You can't really sub out one of, Kyrie or Gafford in that starting lineup just to get more size on the wing, or in the wing position. You can't really do that. The Mavericks just don't have the personnel to do that. So, Luka's going to have to guard one of those three guys, which is the luxury of why you go and trade for James Harden, is for a playoff series like this, where you're playing a sort of not smaller team by any means, but a team that doesn't have the personnel in that starting lineup to deal with you, or to deal with three, stars. That's why you go and make that trade. And that's why the Clippers, all season long have really dominated almost every team outside of that, last 30 or 35 games. But, if Kawhi is in the lineup, it's obviously going to make things a lot more difficult for the Mavericks, which is sad to say because it looked as difficult as it could be, without Kawhi. But yeah, I mean, I think that Luka is probably going to have to pick up. I don't want to say he's going to pick up Kawhi Leonard because I just don't think he has that physicality, but I could very well see him guarding James Harden. I think Harden is kind of a different type of player whenever Kawhi's in the lineup. He's more relied upon to be the point guard. He's not going to take advantage of these mismatches as much. He's obviously looking to get other guys involved a lot more. I want to say he was probably, top 5 in assists this season once again. Just trying to find guys with the open matchups. Obviously, he has the shot, he has the creation ability to score, which we saw in the first game. But yeah, if I had to guess, it would probably be Luka and James Harden. You obviously don't want to see Luka guarding the guy bringing up the ball. That's just a recipe for disaster. But in this case scenario, I think that Luka's gonna have to try his best. Do
Yeah.
you think in any world do you see Kawhi, or do you see a Kyrie maybe guarding James Harden?
Yeah, I was just actually going to allude to that. That was going to be my next point. I could, I talked about that in the, series preview, and they have the familiarity in terms of, having played together. They got a little chirpy at one point in game one, which I thought was interesting. I wonder, exactly how both of their exits from Brooklyn, went into how their relationship is now today. I'm sure it's not too terrible off the court, but I, wonder if there's any sort of baggage there. nonetheless, I thought that, I think Kyrie, especially in a guy like Harden, who doesn't have too much of a length advantage of him, maybe only about 3 inches taller. Now lengthwise, obviously, probably a little longer, but Kyrie, he especially, in the playoffs, from what we saw, he's very intense defensively. There will be a couple possessions, both him and Luca, where, they may get blown by rather quickly, or you can kind of catch them off guard, off ball, and that guy's able to make a corner three. That's just kind of the nature of the offensive workload that they have to deal with. And, them, being a little bit tired on defense sometimes, when you're asking guys to play 35 plus minutes in a playoff series, stuff like that can happen sometimes. And it just kind of is what it is. But, in terms of, I kind of like Kyrie guarding Harden in, a scenario where Kawhi's in the starting lineup, because I don't think, I think James is going to be operating more at the point of attack, looking to get guys involved more. Kyrie's a really good guy, staying hip to hip to guys. He's very good at contesting with his body. He gets up into the space of guys really well, despite, not being able to, use his length to, getting guys, face all the time. So, he's very, uh, very astute, as a post defender, and being able to like pull the chair on guys, and, use just all those like intelligent little tricks to be able to get, steals and whatnot. So, I mean, Kyrie, his basketball IQ is off the charts. He's obviously, in a matchup versus Harden, I'm not going to act like he's going to dominate him every possession. James is certainly still going to get his, but I do like Kyrie in that matchup. That kind of gives you the ability to slide Luke over to Terrence Mann. Obviously, I think that becomes, a bit of a different aspect, if Harden's making the three like he is, and you just need a little bit more length on him and just some more size. And yeah, you probably end up going to Luca at that point. But I honestly don't hate the, you know, Kyrie on Harden matchup. And as far as how I think the Mavericks regard Paul George and, Kawhi, I think that they'd have to, defer to Derrick Jones Jr. on Paul George, just because, out of two, both Kawhi and Paul George, I think, while Derrick Jones Jr. has probably been the best Mavericks point of attack defender this year, he's just simply not as strong as PJ Washington is. Probably can't deal with the physicality that Kawhi has on some of his drives, and especially just using, his post ability, operating in the mid range and whatnot. I like PJ's strength and his stoutness on that a lot more than I would Derrick Jones Jr. So that's kind of what I would expect from the Mavericks. And, I think especially, as kind of what we talked about in that series preview, Paul George is a little bit more finesse style, sort of game to him. So I like Derrick Jones Jr.'s length and athleticism, and, on that perspective, a lot more. Um, so obviously, with Kawhi out of the lineup, I thought it was smart, for the Mavericks to, go to PJ on, Paul George, because, while Paul George, like, definitely has a sort of more finesse aspect of his, to his game than Kawhi does. He certainly is still physical in his ability to get to the rim, and he's a lot bigger and stronger than Derrick Jones Jr. I mean, Derrick Jones Jr. is a lengthy 6'7", obviously. Like Paul George is, pushing 6'10", and he's got pretty good, muscle on his frame. So, I think that Derrick Jones Jr. kind of got caught in the whirlwind there a little bit, and I honestly think PJ, is just as well equipped, if not better, to guard a guy like that. But, between the two, you'd rather have PJ and Kawhi. I do think PJ, the way he's been playing recently, with his strength and whatnot, is starting to evolve into the Mavericks' best team defender. But that will obviously be battle tested through these playoffs. It's not a narrative that I'm going to sit here and run with, since he wasn't necessarily the best on that end in Charlotte, but since he's been in Dallas, he's proven that he's capable of playing on another level on that end. So that was really encouraging from game one. There's a lot to take. It's late at night. We're both tired here. But I think it'll be really interesting to see what the Mavericks do in game two. I think that after game two, we'll have a lot more clear answers on, if there are some adjustments that, definitively need to be made. We'll see them. But, there's still a lot up in the air for this game, but I do expect the Mavericks, like we talked about, plenty of times here, to come out and play much harder in this game, point blank, just from an effort perspective, going out and getting loose balls, both defensively and offensively. And, you would hope that they have some sort of positive regression from a shooting perspective, but we will see. But obviously, pretty atrocious shooting night from a 3-point perspective the other night, and you got to hope that some of Dallas's role players are able to forge a little bit of offensive creation and playmaking, especially if the Mavericks cannot hit open threes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, going into game two, as we've mentioned before, energy has got to be a lot higher, intensity's got to be a lot higher. I would be surprised to see the Mavericks not work in a high screen pick and roll or some sort of alley-oop lob to one of Lively or Gafford early in the game. Preferably Gafford. I think he's going to play a lot more, obviously. Sorry. But I would be surprised to see the Mavericks not work that in early in the game plan. Kind of set, a tone, set a point of emphasis that, they're going to drive that down your throat and that they're going to make that work. And, obviously that didn't work in game one. The intensity all across the board just wasn't there. So I would be surprised to see the Mavericks not go to that early, like I said, just to try and send a message to the Clippers. Obviously they're going to have to try and take Zubats out of this game early. One of which is, Will, you mentioned this earlier. Luka does a really good job of snaking pick and rolls. As long as you can get Gafford in a preferable, offensive position, you can always use a Gortat screen just to get an easy bucket to the hole. Or, you can always kick out, and hopefully one of our corner shooters is going to actually nail a corner three. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of adjustments the Mavericks need to make going into game two. Obviously, as far as lineup adjustments, minutes, starting lineup, everything like that, we probably won't know a definitive answer until after game two. If Gafford puts up yet another stinker, and Maxey, plays as good as Maxey can play, we could see a starting lineup change there, or at least a minute change there. We could see a huge swing in that direction. This is all speculation at this point. But it is clear the Mavericks just need to come out with better intensity, and better energy for obvious reasons, or else they can easily go down 0-2 in this series, with little hope going into Dallas, for game three. So, that'd be my big thing, is just looking to see how they're coming out of the game, what sort of offensive sets they're running within the first minute or two of the game. I think that's going to be a huge indicator of how this team will play for that full 48 minutes.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be exciting to see. Obviously, quick turnaround. Just one day of rest here Monday night, and they're back here Tuesday night at Crypto.com Arena, and we will see the Mavericks in yet another playoff game here. Game two is upon the horizon. If you're listening to this, it'll probably be coming out Tuesday morning, so you probably will not have too many hours till game two. But we are excited to be back on the mic right after game two, hopefully with a much different result. Hopefully we are not tripping about the Mavericks season going dramatically downhill and everything being lost, because that could be the difference just between one game in terms of the vibes. But I do have faith that the Mavericks can hopefully revitalize their season here and get back on track. It's just like we've done with our podcast. So, just two bricks and a stone. I'm sorry, I have no analogy for the state, guys. I'm a little off kilter at this moment, but it's been a good podcast. Hopefully, it'll be a better podcast tomorrow night. It's been Will and Jaren, the Mainstream Mavs podcast. Make sure to hit our socials at Will Miljay, my personal Twitter, at Jaren Boslow, his Twitter. Make sure to get us on Twitter, of course, or X, whatever you want to call it, at Mainstream214. And we're of course on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, all that good stuff. We appreciate you guys if you're listening, watching on YouTube. No question for today. The vibes are not there for today. We'll give you guys a question in the next YouTube. But nonetheless, on to a better game two. It's been Will and Jaren with the Mainstream Mavs podcast, signing out.
Bye-bye.